You think your life is hard? Try growing up in the Middle Ages. Modern comforts have made us soft, and what medieval people dealt with daily would shock you to your core. There were no smartphones, no cartoons, no playgrounds, just work, survival, and a whole lot of dirt. Medieval kids didn't have toys or school breaks. They had chores, responsibilities, and if they were lucky, maybe a game of dice before bedtime. In this video, we'll take you through a day in the life of a medieval child, from sunrise to sunset, and show you how they spent their time in a world without modern comforts. Let's go back 700 years and find out what it really meant to be a kid in medieval times. For most children, childhood was short and often brutal. The average lifespan was around 30 to 40 years, but that number is skewed by high infant mortality. About 30% of children died before the age of 5. If you survived infancy, your days were filled with work, even as a toddler. Poor families couldn't afford to let anyone sit idle. Children as young as 3 or 4 would help with basic tasks like feeding animals, gathering firewood, or watching over younger siblings. Toys were rare and usually handmade: wooden dolls, carved animals, or simple rag-filled cloth figures. But don't feel too bad for them. At least they didn't have homework. Let's imagine a medieval child waking up at dawn. No alarm clock, just the rooster crowing and the smell of yesterday's stew warming over the fire. Their day didn't start with cartoons or breakfast cereal. It started with chores. If you were born into a peasant family, your life was work from sunrise to sunset. There were no weekends, no school breaks, no summer vacation, just survival. Children as young as 3 or 4 would help gather firewood, carry water, or chase away birds from the fields. By age 6 or 7, they were expected to work full-time alongside adults. There were no toys in stores, but that didn't mean kids had nothing to play with. They made their own. Wooden swords for boys, rag dolls for girls, and simple board games carved into stone or wood. Dice, marbles, and hoop rolling were popular pastimes when they could find a moment to play. But most of the time, there was no time for fun. Food was scarce, and every extra pair of hands was needed to make sure the next meal would come. Bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables were in season made up most of their diet. Meat was rare. Ale was common, even for children, because clean drinking water was hard to find. Winters were the hardest. With no central heating, entire families huddled together under thick wool blankets. Some even slept with animals to stay warm. Frostbite wasn't uncommon. Illness was everywhere. So what did medieval kids really do all day? Let's break it down, minute by minute. Education in medieval times was a luxury most kids never experienced. If you were born into a noble family, your life looked very different from peasant children. While they were sweeping floors and herding sheep, noble kids were learning Latin, reading religious texts, and practicing proper etiquette. Boys from wealthy families often started formal education around age 7. Some were sent to monasteries or hired private tutors. Girls learned domestic skills, embroidery, music, dancing, and how to manage a household. But for the majority of the population, especially peasants, education was practically non-existent. Most people couldn't read or write at all. Knowledge was passed down orally. Stories, songs, and superstitions became their textbooks. And if you made a mistake during lessons, well, let's just say discipline was strict. Corporal punishment was common. A wrong answer could earn you a slap, a pinch, or even a beating with a stick. Schools, when they existed, were often run by the church. The goal wasn't to encourage curiosity or creativity. It was to prepare students for a life of obedience and faith. There were no science classes, no history books, and definitely no math tests. Instead, students memorized prayers, copied manuscripts by hand, and studied theology. If you were lucky enough to attend school, you sat on hard wooden benches, huddled near a small fire for warmth, and wrote on wax tablets or scraps of parchment using ink made from crushed berries or animal blood. Books were rare and extremely expensive. A single Bible could cost as much as a house. So forget about borrowing one from a library. For most medieval kids, education meant learning how to survive, not how to read. Believe it or not, medieval kids did play when they could. Their games were often imitations of adult life. Boys played mock battles with wooden swords, girls played with dolls or practiced housework with miniature tools. Popular games included Nine Men's Morris, an early version of checkers, skittles, similar to modern bowling, hoodman blind, a medieval version of blindman's bluff, kendama and jacks, using bones or stones instead of plastic pieces. Children also loved playing ball games in the streets or fields, though kicking a ball through someone's window meant serious trouble. During festivals or village gatherings, kids might get to watch traveling performers, jugglers, or hear bards tell epic tales. It wasn't Disney, but it was entertainment. Some games had religious origins, like St. Nicholas versus the Devil, where one child played a saint while another played a demon, and others had to choose sides. Other games were surprisingly brutal. One popular pastime involved blindfolding a child, spinning them around, and letting them swing a stick at a hanging object, sometimes a live animal. Yes, medieval childhood wasn't exactly cruelty-free. Music and dance were also part of daily life. Kids learned folk songs that told stories of heroes, monsters, and local legends. They used simple instruments like flutes, drums, and tambourines. Dancing was a social activity, and many dances were performed in circles to celebrate harvests or holy days. Storytelling was another major form of entertainment. Without books or screens, oral tradition kept myths and legends alive. Children grew up hearing tales of dragons, witches, and magical creatures, some of which shaped the fairy tales we know today. But even these moments of joy were short-lived. Playtime was limited because there was always work to do. Games were often quick, spontaneous, and interrupted by chores. Still, for a brief moment, medieval kids got to be kids, before returning to the harsh reality of everyday life. For most medieval kids, playtime was limited, because there was always work to do. On farms, children helped plant seeds, harvest crops, gather eggs, and feed livestock. In towns, they worked alongside their parents, grinding grain, selling goods, or helping in shops. Some were even apprenticed as young as 7. They'd live with a master craftsman, learning trades like blacksmithing, shoemaking, or weaving, often working 14-hour days, 6 days a week. No weekends, no sick leave, just work until you were old enough to work somewhere else. And if you messed up, you got beaten, or worse. Apprenticeships were common for boys from poor families who couldn't afford formal schooling. Girls usually learned domestic skills from their mothers, spinning wool, making bread, cleaning, and caring for younger siblings. There was no concept of child labor laws. Work started early and ended late. If you were lucky, you had a few minutes after sunset to eat and rest before falling asleep on a straw mattress shared with your brothers and sisters. If you lived in a village, you might see other kids during festivals or market days. These were the only times when children could play freely, run around, and enjoy themselves without being scolded for wasting time. But those moments were rare. Most of the year, life was about survival. Even noble children weren't completely free from responsibilities. While they didn't have to carry firewood or herd sheep, they still had duties, learning how to manage an estate, practicing diplomacy, and preparing for marriage alliances. A boy born into nobility would be sent away to another noble household at age 7 or 8 to begin his training as a page. He would serve under a lord or knight, learning manners, combat, and courtly behavior. At 14, he became a squire, and by 16 or 18, he could become a full knight, if he survived long enough. Medieval kids didn't just suffer from hard work and lack of education, they also faced terrifying medical practices that would make modern children scream for their parents. Sickness was common and deadly. With poor hygiene, contaminated water, and little medical knowledge, diseases spread quickly. Common illnesses included dysentery, measles, tuberculosis, and worms. Parents used herbal remedies, some helpful, many useless, or even dangerous. Mercury, leeches, and bloodletting were considered cures for everything from headaches to fevers. Toothaches were treated with pliers and alcohol. If you survived illness, you were lucky. Without understanding of germs or infection, medieval people believed illness came from bad air or an imbalance of the 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Got a fever? Time for bloodletting, cutting open a vein and draining blood into a bowl. Leeches were another popular treatment. One medical text recommended using 70 leeches at once for certain conditions. The mortality rate from disease was staggering. About 30% of children died before age 5, and the average life expectancy was between 30 and 40 years. The bubonic plague killed roughly 50% of Europe's population in the mid-14th century. Dental problems were particularly awful. With no proper toothbrushes or understanding of dental hygiene, tooth decay was common. Medieval dentists didn't need appointments. They just waited until someone screamed loud enough to be heard through town. Even the medicines that were available were often deadly. Mercury was prescribed for everything from skin conditions to syphilis. Their prescription drugs didn't need warning labels about side effects. The side effect was always, might kill you faster than the disease. The worst part? Many diseases spread because of poor understanding of hygiene. Their idea of hand sanitizer was wiping their palms on their already filthy clothes, which is like trying to clean a muddy shoe with a dirty sock. Winters were especially harsh. Without central heating or warm clothing, staying alive was a daily challenge. Kids huddled together under thick wool blankets, sometimes sleeping in the same bed with multiple siblings, or even animals, to stay warm. Frostbite wasn't uncommon, neither was starvation. Food was scarce in winter, and many families rationed what little they had. If you were caught stealing bread, you could lose a hand. So yeah, Christmas wasn't all carols and cookies. During cold months, entire families shared one room to conserve heat. Fires burned low, and smoke filled the house because chimneys were rare. Most homes had only a small hole in the roof to let out smoke, if they had one at all. Children slept close together, sometimes with livestock in the same room for warmth. It wasn't cozy, it was survival. Frostbite and hypothermia were real dangers. Without gloves, hats, or socks, fingers and toes were especially vulnerable. In extreme cases, limbs would blacken and rot, and there was no pain relief beyond alcohol and prayer. Food supplies dwindled as winter dragged on. Grains, dried meats, and salted fish were stored during harvest season, but by January or February, food was running low. Malnutrition made kids more vulnerable to disease. Scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency-related illnesses were common. And if you got sick during winter, good luck. There were no antibiotics, no hospitals, and no painkillers. Just herbs, superstition, and suffering. Some people turned to charms, prayers, or visits to local healers who mixed magic with medicine. Others relied on astrology, blaming illness on bad planetary alignments. If you survived winter, you weren't out of danger yet. Spring brought new risks, including outbreaks of disease caused by poor sanitation and overcrowded living conditions. Life for rich kids versus poor kids was night and day. Noble children had servants, tutors, and fine clothes. They ate real meals, meat, bread, and wine diluted with water, because straight wine was too strong. Peasant kids? They drank ale. Yes, even toddlers, because water was unsafe. Rich kids learned fencing and horseback riding. Poor kids learned how to survive. One group dreamed of ruling kingdoms, the other dreamed of surviving another week. But even among the wealthy, childhood wasn't easy. At around age 7, noble boys were often sent away to live in another noble household as pages. This was a form of early education where they served under a lord or knight, learning manners, combat, and courtly behavior. By 14, they became squires, assisting knights in battle, and training to become knights themselves. Girls from noble families stayed at home, learning domestic skills like embroidery, music, dancing, and managing a household. Marriage was their main career path. For peasant children, the future was bleak. Most followed in their parents' footsteps, working the land, cleaning, cooking, or helping in shops. There was no concept of retirement. People worked until they dropped. If you were lucky, you lived long enough to see your own children grow up. If not, you died young, like most of your friends. Social mobility was nearly impossible. About 90% of the population were peasants who owned nothing and worked land belonging to nobles. Moving up in station or changing occupations rarely happened. Knowledge was limited, and superstition filled the gaps. Most people believed in witches, demons, and magical creatures. Medical problems were attributed to evil spirits, bad air, or astrological influences. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic, believing the world was ending. Communication was slow and unreliable, News traveled at the speed of a walking messenger or horseback rider. Information from 50 miles away might take days to arrive, and news from other countries could take months, if it arrived at all. Death was everywhere, and so was religion. Church was a big part of life. Kids attended Mass regularly, learned prayers, and participated in rituals. Many believed illness came from sin, and healing came from God. Some children joined monasteries as choir boys or apprentices, giving up family life for spiritual service. Others grew up believing in witches, demons, and magical creatures. Medical problems were attributed to evil spirits, bad air, or astrological influences. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic, believing the world was ending. Medieval fact-checking consisted of asking the oldest person in the village if they'd heard the same thing before. For many kids, the only escape from hard labor was joining the church. Monastic schools offered education, food, and shelter, but at the cost of a lifetime of obedience and celibacy. If you were lucky enough to be chosen as an apprentice monk or choir boy, your future was set. But for most, religion meant fear, not comfort. The idea of eternal damnation was drilled into children from birth. Every misfortune, sickness, death, famine, was seen as divine punishment. Ghosts, curses, and haunted places were real threats. Even playtime had religious rules. Some games were banned by the church as sinful or pagan. If you somehow survived the food, the filth, the disease, and the constant threat of violence, there was still one more medieval horror waiting for you: justice, or rather, the complete lack of it. Medieval law wasn't about fairness. It was about power, fear, and public spectacle. Punishments were brutal, trials were bizarre, and being accused of a crime usually meant one thing: suffering. First off, laws varied from town to town. What was legal in one village could get you executed just a few miles away. There were no standardized legal codes, only local rules enforced by whoever had the most swords. If you were accused of a crime, proving your innocence often involved something called trial by ordeal. One method was making you carry a red-hot iron bar for several feet. If your burns healed cleanly after 3 days, you were innocent. If they got infected, which they almost always did, you were guilty. Another version was trial by water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and executed. The logic? Water, being pure, would reject the guilty. Either way, you were probably dead. Public executions were common entertainment. Crowds gathered with food and drinks to watch hangings, burnings, and even the occasional drawing and quartering, where the condemned was dragged through the streets, hanged, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and cut into 4 pieces. Nobles sometimes avoided this by demanding trial by combat, basically hiring a professional fighter to beat the crap out of their accuser. Even minor crimes carried extreme punishments. Stealing bread could mean losing a hand. Talking back to your husband as a woman might land you strapped to a ducking stool and dunked repeatedly in filthy water. Jails weren't for long-term punishment. They were holding cells until your actual punishment began. Dungeons were dark, overcrowded, and disgusting. No food was provided unless your family brought it. Torture was normal. Thumbscrews, racks, and iron maidens were used to extract confessions, true or false. Most people confessed just to stop the pain, but that rarely saved them from execution anyway. So even if you managed to survive everything else, the medieval justice system made sure you never really felt safe. If you were born a girl in medieval times, your life was even harder and shorter. From birth, girls had fewer rights, less freedom, and far fewer choices than boys. Most were seen as property, first of their fathers, later of their husbands. Education was rare, and even noble girls were taught only what was needed to manage a household or make a good marriage. Girls started working at the same age as boys, but their tasks were different. They helped with cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, and looking after younger siblings. In rural areas, they gathered firewood, milked animals, and helped in the fields during harvest season. In towns, they worked in kitchens, markets, or workshops. Some became domestic servants in wealthier homes, where long hours, poor food, and the risk of abuse were common. Marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival and family alliances. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were married off to much older men. Once married, they were expected to bear children, often repeatedly. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. Without pain relief, sterile conditions, or medical knowledge, many women died giving birth, sometimes taking their babies with them. Even in childhood, girls were treated differently. While boys played mock battles and learned fighting skills, girls were discouraged from rough play. Their toys, if they had any, were simple dolls or miniature kitchen tools meant to prepare them for domestic life. Religious life offered one of the few escapes from this fate. Some girls joined convents, where they could learn to read, write, and sometimes even study music or medicine, but this came at a cost. A lifetime of celibacy and obedience. For most, there was no escape. Life was work, marriage, childbirth, and often an early death. Medieval cities weren't just dangerous, they were disgusting. Imagine walking down a street where the air smells like rotten meat, human waste, and unwashed bodies. That's exactly what most medieval towns smelled like. Without garbage collection or sanitation systems, trash piled up in the streets. Butchers dumped animal guts and blood outside their shops. Tanners soaked hides in urine and chemicals that turned their skin yellow and made them smell awful. People threw everything, from food scraps to chamber pots, out their windows with nothing but a shout of "Gardyloo!" before dumping the contents onto unsuspecting pedestrians below. Bathing was rare. Most people believed water opened the pores and let disease inside the body, so instead of washing, they changed clothes often, except they didn't really have extra clothes to change into. The average person owned only 2 or 3 outfits their entire life. Undergarments were rough linen that irritated the skin. Outer garments were heavy wool that itched constantly. Shoes were thin leather with no soles, basically fancy socks for your feet. Personal hygiene was practically non-existent. Lice and fleas were everywhere. Special combs were used to try and remove them, but it was nearly impossible to stay clean. Bedbugs infested straw mattresses shared by entire families, sometimes even strangers when travelers passed through. Privacy? Forget about it. Most homes had one room where everyone ate, worked, slept, and even used the bathroom. Even wealthy homes had servants around all the time, including during private moments. Entertainment options were limited and often violent. Public executions were treated like festivals. Animal baiting, where dogs attacked chained bears or bulls, was popular. Less gruesome options included traveling performers or listening to bards tell stories, but those were rare treats. Communication was painfully slow. News traveled at the speed of a messenger on horseback. Information from 50 miles away might take days to arrive, and news from other countries could take months if it arrived at all. Books were rare and extremely expensive. A single Bible cost as much as a house. Most people couldn't read anyway. Superstition filled the gaps in knowledge. Most believed in witches, demons, and magical creatures. A solar eclipse could send an entire town into panic, believing the world was ending. If you somehow survived all this, there was still one last horror waiting for you. So what did medieval kids really do all day? They worked, they prayed, they played when they could, but mostly, they survived. Childhood, as we know it today, simply didn't exist in the Middle Ages. Being a kid meant being useful, or being forgotten. There were no birthdays, no toys, no cartoons, just chores, responsibilities, and the constant threat of disease, punishment, or war. If you made it to adulthood, you were lucky. If not, well, graveyards were full of kids your age. By now, you're probably desperate to go back to the 21st century. And honestly, who could blame you? Medieval life was brutal, filthy, and terrifying. From birth to death, survival was a daily challenge. You had to worry about what you ate, where you slept, who might accuse you of witchcraft, and whether your local doctor would try to cure you by draining your blood or attaching leeches to your face. Even if you somehow survived all that, there was always the chance of being drafted into a war, thrown into a dungeon, or burned at the stake for something as simple as saying the wrong thing to the wrong noble. The past may seem romantic in movies, with knights in shining armor, fair maidens, and grand feasts. But the reality was far less glamorous. Most people lived short, hard lives filled with work, disease, and fear. There were no weekends, no sick days, and definitely no vacations. If you were lucky enough to reach adulthood, you were already considered long-lived. And even then, death could come at any moment, from plague, famine, war, or the local justice system. So next time you complain about school, traffic, or having to wait 5 minutes for your coffee, remember, at least you're not drinking ale for breakfast, dodging human waste falling from windows, or getting beaten for misspelling a word in class. Thanks for watching. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more medieval madness. See you in the next one.